Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon to all of you. Today, I'd like to discuss with you one theory of learning or one prominent theory noted in first language acquisition. Beforehand, let me introduce myself. My name is Andre Anugrah, so I've been teaching English since 2010. I'm currently residing in Bandung, pursuing my PhD, my doctoral degree in linguistics. I've been so much absorbed in the field of second language acquisition, first language acquisition, especially respective to transfer issues, interlanguage transfer, or also known as cross linguistic influences. I'm also interested in natural semantic meta language, critical studies, critical sociology, and many other fields, to name a few. let me let me think. I don't think it's worth discussing here, worth mentioning. Um, Today, I'd like to discuss with you a theory of learning, super popular on its heyday. Um, it is behaviorism or behaviorist perspective. Okay, so before we discuss about this theory, which is so important to know, right? So I'd like to discuss with you one hypothesis made or coined by Stephen Krashen. You need to know that acquisition is different from learning. Okay, what makes them different? So, um, if you want to further read the theories or the five hypotheses of second language acquisition, go download a PDF, okay, PDF for free for sure. Principles and practice in second language acquisition, available on the internet for sure for free. Right. So the first hypothesis is called the acquisition learning distinction. Um, the acquisition, according to Krashen, is more of a subconscious process, while learning is a conscious process. So, what is the difference? The first way is language acquisition, a process similar, if not identical, to the way children develop ability in their first language. Language acquisition is a subconscious process. Language acquirers are not usually aware of the fact that they are acquiring the language, but are only aware of the fact that they are using the language of communication. Okay. The second way to develop competence in second language is by language learning. We will use the term learning henceforth to refer to conscious knowledge of a second language, knowing the rules, being aware of them, and being able to talk about them. Right. So, probably that was the distinction between acquisition and learning in a nutshell. Right. So, let me put it in a simpler elaboration. So, when you acquire a language or a second language, right, you are not aware of the process of getting this language into your brain, right? So, for example, in a newer theory purported by Stephen Krashen, a free voluntary reading activity, where you take about 10 to 30 minutes a day to read a book without compulsion, without having anyone to compel you to read, right? Without having to answer questions in the end of the chapter you are reading, right? You do the reading voluntarily, right? So, some research reported that children who did some amount of free voluntary reading outperformed those, okay, who took, let's say, grammar preparational course, okay, preparational course, where this is a spatial class designed to improve your grammar, right? So those who read voluntarily, okay, voluntarily, they are willing to read that, they take their time, right? So all the information, all the input that they get from reading, okay, reading, are stored in their long-term memory. So the input, okay, are successfully or were successfully transformed into the so-called comprehensible input. Okay, so what is the comprehensible input? Comprehensible input is also called intake. The moment you absorb information, okay, wherever it is from, for example, you listen to your teacher teaching you some past tense rules, for example, right? So the information delivered, taught, put forth by your teacher is considered input. Anything, any form of information is input. But your brain behaves differently. If your brain understands or comprehends the information you are attaining or you are getting, you're acquiring, okay, from what you hear and from what you listen, it's considered comprehensible, is regarded as a comprehensible input, is an intake. Only comprehensible input, only comprehensible input manages to get into your brain. Then your comprehensible input will pair with your pre-existing knowledge, your prior knowledge. Then your prior knowledge plus your comprehensible input, okay, will turn into or will become newer knowledge. Then as you expose to some other information, that the information can be processed because it is comprehensible and is comprehended by your brain, right? Then it becomes your intake, and that new intake, okay, will be paired by the new knowledge that existed before, and it will form newer knowledge, and so forth and so on, right? You see that one, right? So it's more of a cognitive perspective, right? So it's very important. Why it's very important? Learning can be successful, and it can also be unsuccessful. Why? If the learning takes place in the environment or in the surroundings or in the circumstance where all the information to be stored in the brain will be comprehensible for the brain or will be comprehended by the brain, it means that the learning takes place successfully. Right. But when you are exposing yourself to an environment, to the atmosphere where almost all the information you are exposed to is not comprehensible, it's considered a waste of time because those inputs or that form of input will not be comprehensible for your brain. So the input will not become, will not be transforming into intake. So it will not be stored in the brain. If it is stored, regardless, if it is stored, if it happens to be stored, okay, it will be in your short-term memory. So Um, you might have experience. Let's say that you just finished reading 3 pages of a book, right? And you think that you have understood those pages, right? Right after 3 hours, okay, right after 3 hours, the information you think you have comprehended, you think you have understood, diminishes, right? Subsides. Okay, so I can tell that it might not be comprehensible for the brain. So what makes things comprehensible is so customized, is so customizable, is so personalized. So accounting for the acquisition and learning distinction, what can only be successful? Learning can be successful, and learning can also be unsuccessful. But acquisition is always successful. Why? Because acquisition only demands intakes. Acquisition only demands comprehensible input. Okay, so you can see or observe how baby grows, developing his English skills, right? He watches, he prefers what to watch, what to observe, what to read, right? Everything committed, performed willingly. Then almost everything that they do or that he does or she does is comprehensible for the brain. So there ain't no way to say that acquisition will not succeed. Acquisition will always succeed, right? So today, we are not going to talk about cognitive though. So today we are going to talk about behaviorism. Behaviorism is a bit contradictory to this second language, this acquisition learning distinction. Why? Because behaviorism equates learning with changes in either the form or frequency of observable performances. Learning is accomplished when a proper response is demonstrated following the presentation for a specific environment stimulus, right? For example, when presented with a math flashcard showing that the equation 2 plus 4 equals a question mark, the learner replies with the answer of 6. The equation is the stimulus and the proper answer is the associated response. So, behaviorist perspective is all about stimulus or stimuli and responses. So, the key elements are stimulus or stimuli, the response, and the association between the two. Okay? So, of primary concerns is how the association between the stimulus and response is made, strengthened, fostered, right? And maintained. Behaviorism is focusing on the significance or the importance of consequences of those performances and contends that responses that are followed by reinforcements are more likely to recur in the future. Right. If you count on this theory, probably the experts that you might have heard of before are Pavlov, a psychologist, right? Who tested human behavior with the behavior with that of dogs, right? Training dogs, then trying to put dog in the same level or on the same equation of human behavior, right? Followed by Skinner then, okay? Followed the Skinner then. And so the learner is characterized as being reactive to conditions in the environment as opposed to taking an active role in discovering the environment. So you see what works for Andre, what works for Intan, what works for Dewi, what works for Johnny, for example. You see, you test. If the test um, brings out good results in the end, it means it's success. It's successful. It succeeds. Sorry. It's successful though. So which factors influence learning according to behaviorism? Although both learner and the environmental factors are considered super important by behaviorists, environmental condition receive the greatest emphasis. Behaviorists assess and attest the learners to determine at what point to begin instruction, as well as to determine which reinforcers are more or most effective for a particular student. The most critical factor is the arrangement of stimuli and consequences within the environment, right? So you test things out, right? So what is the status of cognition here, or the memory? Memory is not typically addressed by behaviorists. Not commonly. Not commonly. It's still addressed though, but it's not prominent, right? Although the acquisition of habits is discussed, little attention is given as to how these habits are stored or recalled for future use. So forgetting is attributed to non-use of a response over the time, right? So when you see someone says, or when you see someone say to you that practice, 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 practice makes perfect, then they claim that if you don't use the language you are learning or the language you have mastered, for example, now you have already mastered Arabic, for example. If you don't use that language on daily basis, on hourly basis, or minutely basis, you will forget the language. Sooner or later, the language will leave you. Right? So they believe in this perspective. Why? Forgetting is associated or attributed to non-use of a response over time. Right? So as opposed to cognitive points of view, they believe once the comprehensible input appear or stored, okay, or stored, comprehensible or stored in the brain, they will never, ever, ever be forgotten. Okay, be forgotten. Why? Because when they are stored, when it is comprehensible by the brain, but the brain keeps it for keeps forever, right? So you see now the difference. So if you forget, you don't use it, or you forget some vocabulary words. Oh, it's because you don't use them. So what is the goal? Uncle Ann, the goal is practice. Practice makes perfect. Right. I don't agree with this one actually. Practice doesn't always mean perfection, but practice can reinforce, can forge, can strengthen what you already have. But it does not add up to something you already have in hand, for sure. If you keep practicing your English, honestly speaking, you are not improving your English. You're improving your fluency or your speed. Yet, in terms of accuracy, I don't really think that you will improve your accuracy. Accuracy has something to do with things got fixed, right? Things got fixed. What I mean here is that if your English is diseased, if your English is rich in mistakes, errors, right? Error is a systemic mistake. You don't realize that you're making errors like a machine, though, since you don't have a pre-existing knowledge to detect whether this is correct or this is incorrect. There is error. If it is only a mistake, for example, yesterday I go to the market. Yesterday you go to the market. Yesterday I went to the market. It was only a mistake. You know the rule already. But error was subconsciously driven, right? So now you know the difference. So let's talk about something more important. So we talk about transfer, cross-linguistic influence. So how does transfer take place in behaviorist perspective, or from behaviorist stances? Right. Transfer refers to the applications of learned language in new ways of situation, right? As well as how prior learning affects new learning. So in behavioral learning theories, a transfer is a result of generalization. Generalization, situation involving identical or similar features, allow behaviorists to transfer across common elements. Remember, Lado pointed out the so-called contrastive hypothesis. You know about that? Contrastive analytical hypothesis? Right, so for example, I'm learning English. My mother tongue is Indonesian. At the same time, I'm learning Arabic. Right. To what extent my Arabic is similar to my English learned as a second language? Okay, will shed light the forms of errors you will be potential to make, right? So it depends on the superficial structures, If the nearest, the more similar, the more potential it brings about good transfer or positive transfer. But the more dissimilar the forms of the physical characteristics of your L1 and L2 are, okay, the more potential it brings to the fore negative transfer to your interlanguage. Interlanguage is your language appearing between your target language and your first language, your mother tongue. This is an interlanguage. So if you have not yet reached native proficiency or native fluency, it seems that it indicates that you're still in your interlanguage. Okay, you're still in your interlanguage. So in this interlanguage, a lot of phenomena a lot of phenomena occur. Okay, one of which is transfer, cross-linguistic influences. Okay, the transfer can be good or can be bad, can be negative, it can be positive, right? The similar features, okay, the dissimilar features apply in the first language of yours, will influence the productions of your second language, right? It accounts for the so-called contrastive hypothesis, contrastive analysis hypothesis. Right. So, for example, the student who has learned how to recognize and how to classify elm trees demonstrate transfer when she classified maple trees using the same process, right? And overgeneralization will probably be a factor influencing the transfer, since that the sounds in the second language you are learning or you are acquiring right now do not exist in your first language. Transfer will appear, will come to pass, will turn up. Okay, So, how possible it is to learn a second language in behaviorist perspective? Okay, to make it more possible, to make it more likely to acquire your second language in a more effective and efficient way, is that you count on what the so-called universal implicational universals, or the universal theory. You opt for a number of languages which are quite similar in features, in superficial structural characteristics. Okay, if you can learn, for example, English, German, for example, then some other Anglo languages at the same time, where you can find that they are similar, in a great in 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 great ways. Sorry, I forgot my English. Right, so it's more possible for you to learn, right? So what types of learning best are best explained by this position? Behaviorist endeavors to prescribe strategies that are most useful for building and strengthening stimulus and response, right? Stimulus and response affiliation, association, including the use of instructional cues, practices, and reinforcement. These prescriptions have generally been proven reliable and effective in facilitating learning that involves discrimination, right? Recalling facts, generalization, defining, illustrating concept, association, applying, explanation, chaining, automatically performing a specific procedure. However, it's generally agreed that behaviorist principles cannot adequately explain the acquisition of higher level skills, or those that require a greater depth of processing, language development, problem solving, inference generating, critical thinking. Why? Because you can only observe what you can see. So what happens inside of the brain is none of their business. Is none of their business. But remember, even though this behaviorist theory, has often or frequently been refuted, or probably back then been refuted by a lot of scholars, especially those coming from the school of Chomsky, okay, from Chomskyan school, cognitive school, right? Not to mention critical school. Habermas, Pierre Bourdieu, Jacques Derrida. They don't talk about language though. They are not interested in languages. Derrida, right? Yeah. So I think if you want to, let's say, design a language test, or some language testing, assessment, and evaluation, and you want a shortcut where you don't really want to think whether one question weighs to heaven. What I mean here, okay, is that you just want to make a simple testing. I think you can count on behaviorist learning theory. Take for example ITP tests, institutional testing program, institutional testing program. See the second part, structure and written expression, right? Where you are required to find some errors, okay, some errors within the given underlined phrases or words, right? Now, it's highly inspired by this behaviorist. Okay, is highly inspired by behaviorists, while it turns to while as it turned to example IELTS, it might have accounted or taken cognitive interactionist perspectives into account, right? So what are the basic assumptions or principle of this theory? The first one, this theory has the emphasis upon producing observable, measurable outcomes in students, behavioral objectives, task analysis, criterion reference assessment. Pre-assessment of students are to determine whether instruction should begin, the learner analysis, and also it might be good at uh, doing needs analysis. Needs analysis. It's going to be much simpler when you count on interactionist theory. Needs analysis will be something highly complicating, highly life complicating. While you count on this theory, I think needs analysis can be done so much easier, right? And then this theory emphasizes or accentuates upon use of reinforcement, okay? To get to impact performance, tangible rewards, informative feedbacks, right? Right. Even though it seems indifferent to motivation, but reinforcement in the forms of rewards and punishments, it will elevate or it will bring out the issue of motivations when students perform greatly upon a certain task or perform well on a certain task, that you give them some reward. Okay, it but through the mean, the reward can contribute to building on, okay, better motivation, right? And also the punishment. Probably the punishment, even though it sounds negative, punishment can give us something like what you call the one stirring, alarming reward. Okay, so if I cannot perform this, I'm gonna be punished. So it sounds bad, but it's good, right? But it's good, right? So what else? What do you want to know about this theory more, or the theory more? So let me bring. So I've got this book, right? So I comment on this book, right? Okay, this book has traditional behaviorists hypothesize when children imitated the language produced by those around them, their attempts to reproduce what they heard received positive reinforcement, right? They formed habits of correct language use. The quality and the quantity of language the child hears shape the child's language behavior. Right? So let me read my comment. Though frequently, okay, my comment, though frequently opposed by those believing in the cognitivism, I contend that behaviorist perspective is still hard to completely be refuted, since whatever repeated will be internalized to one's cognitive. Thus, cognitive should rather thank this stance instead of too harshly attacking it. Right. So some something that is quite unique in my opinion. Cognitivists try to rush at this theory, to attack this theory from any angle, okay, from any way, in any way that is possible, right? But remember, how can you monitor one's good or bad cognition or performance recognition? From observing, what can you see externally, right? Right. So treatment by asking or having your students to read or to master a series of tasks, for example, how can you know that it's comprehensible or not comprehensible from them, right? How can you know that? By seeing their outcomes, right? Outcome is monitorable, observable, right? So you cannot tell one's condition of cognition if you don't watch or observe or monitor what comes out of the brain, out of the mind, right? What comes out of the mind. So it's kind of weird. I believe even though you are coming from the cognitive school, you still can count of this theory. At least this theory can be taken into account to help you develop or design a better syllabus, right? Do not stupidly adhere to one theory without understanding the others. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that if you believe in behavioral theory, behaviorist perspectives, right? Try to find out other theories that came after or before the behaviorist perspective, right? Sometimes you are going blindly agreeing upon one single theory and start attacking the previous or the prior one. You just don't know probably that this theory emerged, okay, on account of the prior theory. Let's say when you are embracing deconstruction, Derrida's deconstruction, post structuralist theory, then you start hating Ferdinand de Saussure, right? Ferdinand de Saussure is kind of impossible though. Why? Because Derrida was inspired so much by Saussure, by Saussure's signifié, right? Even though Derrida is intensively or intensely attacking this theory, but he was inspired by this one. But you know nothing, but you start attacking people's theories, right? Right. So be wise and know who you are. Right? And thank you. I think the next video I'm trying to explain or to expatiate upon the innate theory or the universal grammar as opposed to this theory. We will talk about the good and the bad sides of that theory. Okay, I hope this video will be useful for any of you learning languages. Bye bye.